Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. We're going to wait a couple extra minutes to see if anyone else trickles in. All right, let's get started. Can everyone see my screen? Just give me a thumbs up. Perfect. Great. It's so good to see you all. I hope everyone's enjoying their Thanksgiving Eve and getting some time this week to take care of yourself and eat some good food. Before we jump in, I'll share a little bit about my background and what brings me to the space. So, my name is Mina, and I'm currently getting my doctorate at the Stanford PAU PsyD Consortium. I'm training to be a clinical psychologist, and I'm also currently a therapist at the VA, so I'm working with veterans. And in my practice, I'm primarily drawn to psychodynamic therapy, somatic and mindfulness-based approaches to healing. And like many of you, I'm deeply fascinated by psychedelic medicine. I'm so grateful and excited to be entering the mental health field now, during the psychedelic renaissance, when we're seeing so much incredible research and scholarship evidencing the transformative healing potential of psychedelic medicine. Um, and I've been interested in consciousness, especially non-ordinary states of consciousness, for as long as I can remember. Before coming to Stanford, I studied cognitive science at Yale, so I could learn more about consciousness from different lenses of psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, and spirituality. But beyond my academic interest, my true love is psychedelic facilitation. And it's been a huge honor to be able to serve as one of the psychedelic facilitators at the Buena Vida, bridging what we know about psychedelic science and medicine with ancient shamanic healing traditions. So, without further ado, let's jump into it. So, by the very fact that you're here, I'm sure you're all aware that the topic of psychedelics is exploding in the media, and amazing research is taking place, substantiating profound clinical breakthroughs for a broad swath of mental health disorders. including, just to name a few applications, research has provided evidence that psychedelics are effective in ameliorating treatment-resistant depression, end-of-life anxiety, addiction, and there are some ongoing trials that are looking at psilocybin treatment for anorexia and some symptoms associated with Parkinson's, chronic pain, amongst others. And so, in the midst of all this hype in the media, and as you've maybe been doing some research to figure out if you want to try psychedelics, you've probably heard a few key terms that have been thrown out a lot, like the entropic brain, neuroplasticity, default mode network, amongst many others. And maybe you have a vague idea about what some of these terms mean. Maybe they just sound like buzzwords. But my goal with this presentation is to give you an overview of the basic mechanisms that underlie psychedelic healing and root them in some of the most seminal scientific findings. So, in the next 20 or 30 minutes, we're going to talk about how the brain is a prediction machine. We're going to define what the default mode network is. We'll define functional connectivity. We'll learn about how psilocybin desynchronizes the human brain. We'll understand what the entropic brain is, how mystical experiences play into all of this, and the importance of integration. And I'll make sure to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. Okay, so in order to understand how psychedelics impact the brain, we should first have an understanding of how our brain works at baseline. So we can think about our brain as a prediction machine. And of course, there are many theories about how the brain works, but one of the prevailing theories in modern neuroscience suggests that the brain's primary job is not simply to react to the world, but it's to predict it. So our brain is constantly making predictions about what's going to happen next, based on our past experiences and our understanding of the world. In technical terms, the brain is constantly comparing what we expect, our priors, and what we perceive, the sensory input. And the difference between these two is called prediction error. As a prediction machine, the brain is wired to minimize the amount of prediction error. And it does so by basically filtering the sensory information that we perceive in order to match our expectations. So this might sound pretty complicated. Let's break it down. When we're born, the world appears as this swirling mass of color, sound, sensation, and we have no conceptual framework or story to make sense of what's going on. We're just awash in sensation. But of course, from very early on in our development, we start to recognize patterns, we develop concepts, and then we apply those concepts to what we see. And eventually, our brain begins to filter the world through those concepts and make predictions based on what we've experienced in the past. And this is actually pretty adaptive. Oh, sorry, I see there's some chats. Oh, thank you. Okay. So it's pretty adaptive because it would be extraordinarily exhausting and metabolically costly for us to always see everything with absolutely fresh eyes, and to have to figure out what everything means or how we feel about it new in every moment. And there's also infinite perceptual information out there that we could be processing at any moment. So, as Aldous Huxley famously said, the brain acts as a reducing valve that filters the overwhelming amount of information around us into a manageable and intelligible stream of experience. And so, as we develop, our concepts and our predictions drive our perception. So the prediction system works at every level, and we can understand this first in the simplest perceptual level. So you might see a splash of green and brown in your peripheral vision when you're driving, and your brain might automatically process the concept of tree, and it might even fill in some details that you didn't actually see. Here's an optical illusion example that you may have seen before. So, which square is darker? You can put it in the chat or shout it out.
A looks darker.
It's definitely A. Except I know you're trying to trick us.
Well, surprise, surprise, they're actually the same color. But your brain over time has learned about how shadows work. And so it's making the prediction about what it expects to see, and it's even adjusting your perception according to that understanding. Okay, so why is all of this important? Well, this prediction mechanism also shapes the deepest parts of our self-concepts. So if someone grew up with trauma and internalized the belief, I am unlovable, for example, their brain might automatically filter social cues to confirm that belief. Not because it's true, but because that's the prediction that the brain knows how to make. And so our brains can become rigid filters, and over time, our understanding of the world and ourselves might become limited by predictions that perhaps no longer serve us. So, what's actually going on in the brain here? This brings us to the default mode network, which is a set of brain regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, amongst others, that become active and fire in coordination when we're thinking about ourselves. So, thinking about like your inner narrator or your inner critic, when we're ruminating, or if we're forecasting into the future or reviewing the past. And thinking in terms of Buddhism or spiritual traditions, we can also think of the default mode network as like the monkey mind or the ego self. Quick terminology detour. When we're talking about the default mode network, we're not just talking about activity level in discrete regions of the brain. We're talking about functional connectivity. And that is the measure of the degree to which neural oscillations are synchronized across different brain regions. So the default mode network is not a local spot of the brain that's activated. It's a network of brain regions that reliably fire together. And generally, when parallel activity will suggest a mutual contribution to a certain psychological process. In this case, whenever we're ruminating or we're caught up in stories about ourselves, we can assume that the default mode network is activated. And understanding the default mode network is really important because various studies have shown that activity in the default mode network is one of the key neurological signatures of mental health issues. Since the default mode network's job is to stabilize our self-narrative and reduce uncertainty, it tends to produce this repetitive, self-focused rumination. And many forms of psychological suffering, like depression, anxiety, trauma, OCD, the default mode network becomes overactive and hyperconnective, meaning the brain is stuck in recycling the same predictions and interpretations instead of updating them. And we can think about this in terms of being locked in these familiar conditioned patterns of thought, which many of us can relate to in moments of our life when we've been feeling stuck. And a helpful metaphor is to imagine your brain as a snowy mountain. Every time you respond to a situation or you think in a particular way, it's like you're taking a sled down that mountain. And the more you repeat a thought or reaction, the more that path gets carved into the snow. So you may have heard the adage that neurons that fire together wire together. Indeed, over the years, especially in the context of depression or anxiety, these paths become deep ruts. And the default mode network, which stores our beliefs or predictions like, I'm not good enough or things won't work out, keeps sending us down the same slopes over and over. So you can probably see where this is going. Following this classic metaphor, we can visualize that psilocybin essentially brings us a fresh snowfall. And what does the fresh snowfall look like in the brain? Well, what we see is that the brain under psilocybin has reduced functional connectivity, so less joint activity of the default mode network. As a result, that rigid filter that generally limits the information that we take in based on our predictions is temporarily disrupted. And consequently, we're able to have more access to ourselves, to deeper parts of our own psyche, and to the world. And without all our beliefs and preconditions that are driving our perception, we can access a subjective state that you might know as beginner's mind in like meditation circles. Okay, so to recap, what we're seeing is a desynchronization of the default mode network. So within the network that houses our sense of self, we're seeing less coordinated activity. But meanwhile, the rest of the brain is and enters what the researcher Robin Carhart Harris has famously called an entropic brain state. So you may be familiar with the term entropy. It's a measure of disorder, randomness, or unpredictability in the system. And usually the brain fires in a principled and rather predictable way. So normal waking consciousness is relatively low entropy. Stable, it's organized. As we've described, it's pretty rigid. But psychedelics increase the noise and randomness in our neural activity, making the brain state higher in entropy. So this higher entropy state allows for more cognitive flexibility, novel associations, and importantly, access to previously inhibited emotional material. So while the brain is usually pretty segregated under psychedelics, there's a lot more functional connectivity across the brain. So in other words, regions of the brain that usually don't talk to one another begin to talk. And to understand this, you can think about how people often have synesthetic experiences when they're on psychedelics. So, for example, the experience of being able to see music. And that's a result of this increased cross-modular communication. So, more joint activity in the occipital and temporal lobes, for example. So, here's where the concept of neuroplasticity, which we've all heard so much about, comes in. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to change or to be molded. So it's not the change per se, it's the state of changeability. So when we think about the brain on psilocybin, we can return to the fresh snowfall metaphor. The medicine doesn't bring about the change itself, but it helps disrupt the rigid patterns that constrict us and allows us to be deliberate in deciding the new directions that we want to move in. And that's why integration is so important. And that's a topic that we'll return to in just a little bit. Another important concept to note here is that of critical periods. So some research has shown that psychedelics might reopen certain critical periods. Critical periods are these developmental windows when our neural circuits are especially plastic and sensitive to the environment, which is conducive to rapid learning. So, for example, we all have critical periods for a critical period for language acquisition. So when we're born, we have the capacity to hear phonemes, different units of sound in every language. But as we grow up, the neuronal pathways that we don't use essentially wither away. And this is a process that's called neural pruning. And so then we only retain the capacity to hear the phonemes of the language that we've been exposed to and that we need to survive in our environment. Analogously, we can think about critical periods for a lot of learning that happens about our most fundamental beliefs about the world and about ourselves. And so the entropic brain state under psychedelics may allow us to reopen some of our critical periods for learning new associations and for updating our schemas. And the research in this area is still preliminary, but it's very promising. Okay, congratulations, everyone. We have made it through the main mechanism. But I thought it would be helpful now to narrow in on one specific study that was very groundbreaking, just to get a little bit of a sense of the methodology that scientists are using to understand how the brain looks when it's under psilocybin. So one landmark study that was published in the prestigious journal Nature looked at repeated fMRI scans of individuals before, during, and after a high dose of psilocybin. And they wanted to see how psilocybin affects the brain's functional connectivity over time, and then also how those changes related to the subjective experience and the enduring effects of psychedelics. So, briefly, to go over the methodology, each participant completed 18 fMRI sessions. So it's a lot. They did many before the trip to establish a baseline, during the dosing to understand their brain activity during the trip, and then after to track the lasting change. And they also wanted to compare the individual's brain state under psilocybin to their brain under another psychostimulant so that they could better isolate psilocybin's unique effect on the brain. And so each participant received both a high dose of psilocybin and methylphenidate, which is also known as Ritalin. It's a stimulant that's used to treat ADHD. And the dosing sessions were 1 to 2 weeks apart, and the order was randomized. That way, each person could be their own control, which is a pretty savvy research design. And then participants later returned 6 to 12 months later for follow-up. And some of the findings will probably sound like overview based on what we've already covered. But the main findings were that psilocybin decreased activity or synchronization within the default mode network. It increased the global connectivity, which basically means that brain regions that are usually somewhat discrete or more modular had increased communication, as we've discussed. And interestingly, the change in the functional connectivity was more than 3 times greater on psilocybin than with the methylphenidate control. And the study also found that the brain changes correlated with the participants' subjective experience, which we'll talk about in a moment. Finally, they found that the brain changes endured for several weeks. Okay, so let's talk about the subjective experience for a moment. So we know anecdotally and from research that having mystical type experiences during psilocybin is strongly correlated with positive long-term outcomes. And in research, we're able to measure and quantify these mystical experiences using the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. And this asks questions about experiences of unity, of sacredness, transcendence of space and time, a sense of deep peace, and ineffability. And this is a measure that's commonly used in psychedelic studies to try to capture the subjective experience. So the researchers in this nature study also administered the mystical experience questionnaire to participants. And then they compared the subjective experience to their brain function data session by session. And interestingly, they found that the degree of default mode network desynchronization correlated with the intensity of their mystical type experience. And this was especially true for experiences of transcending space and time. So basically, what we're seeing is that neuroscience and phenomenology are telling the same story here. And then finally, another important finding of the study was that over the course of many brain scans, they found that the entropic brain state lasted for up to 3 weeks after psilocybin dosing, which really points to the importance of integration. Because again, psilocybin increases your plasticity, so your brain's ability to change. And so during that period, whatever you practice becomes a lot more likely to stick. You might have a life-changing insight or a mystical experience during your trip, but that's not necessarily going to endure unless you capitalize on the window to repeatedly practice these new habits, the new coping strategies, maybe self-compassion during that period of heightened plasticity. And what we've seen is that's 3 weeks. You have quite a bit to do that. So rather than looking at the trip as a self-contained transformation, the research suggests that we should see it instead as the starting point of our healing journey. So to summarize what we've gone over, the brain is a prediction machine that is shaped by our past. The default mode network creates our sense of self, but it can become rigid. Psilocybin temporarily reduces the default mode network dominance and increases this global connectivity where different parts of the brain that weren't talking to each other now are talking to each other, enhancing the state of entropy. This creates what we can think of as the fresh snowfall period where we have enhanced neuroplasticity. And when we combine intention and integration, this window can support profound psychological healing and growth. So that's all I'm going to cover for today. But thank you all so much for being here. And I'm really happy to answer any questions or hear any reflections.
Hi, I have a question.
Yes, please go ahead.
So I was considering doing this experience, but I'm in a really good moment in my life. I'm very stable, and hearing you talk about like this entropy phenomenon and stuff, I was wondering if it would still be something that is a good idea to do, or it could be destabilizing for a person who feels like it's in a good spot.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for raising that. And I totally hear that fear that just as loosening a dysfunctional belief can be healing, maybe if you feel like you're in a good place, loosening your supportive and stabilizing beliefs can feel pretty destabilizing. So there actually has been a lot of research on healthy or non-clinical populations, and it's shown that most people who are emotionally well don't actually become destabilized. In fact, they tend to have pretty predictable positive experiences with psilocybin, in which they'll have even greater emotional breakthroughs or feel more gratitude or enhanced meaning. Um, but it is important to note that destabilization can happen, especially or even in emotionally well people. Sometimes they might come out of a psychedelic experience and have the emergence of a new spiritual belief that maybe they were atheist and now suddenly they believe in God. And if your entire life you've been atheist, that can be pretty destabilizing, or like it can lead to more existential questioning, or revisiting old material from your past that you didn't really know was still in your psyche. So I think it's a really good question. And that's why, in any event, having a really thoughtful integration period to process what comes up during the journey is essential. Um, yeah,
Thank
so
you.
I hope
Thank
that
you.
answers your question. Yeah, I see Kiara has a question.
Hi, thanks so much for this talk. This has been really illuminating. I'm wondering if you could shed a little more light on some of the like molecular mechanisms behind neuroplasticity or how it is that the brain reaches this new state of entropy or you're able to make new pathways.
Yeah, definitely. So, on the molecular level, that was a little bit more in the weeds than I thought I'd cover in this presentation, but I'm glad you asked. So, basically, after ingestion, psilocybin is rapidly converted into psilocin, and that's a molecule that resembles serotonin closely enough that it binds to several different types of serotonin receptors, which are the 5-HT receptors. And these serotonin receptors are mostly concentrated in like higher order areas of the brain. So, like we discussed, the default mode network or the prefrontal cortex, which are hubs of the brain's hierarchy where the top down high level predictions normally constrain incoming sensory information. And psilocybin or psilocin is an agonist, which means that when it binds to the receptors, it activates them and makes the neurons basically fire more chaotically. I'm simplifying a bit here, but essentially the signal weakens the strength of the top-down predictions and it strengthens bottom-up signals. So raw sensory input becomes a lot stronger and more influential. And that's basically the molecular pathway for what leads to a more flexible, open, and all around vivid state of perception. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thanks so much.
Of course. Will.
Hi there. Thanks. That was really awesome. I noticed that you talked mainly about psilocybin. I was wondering if the effects you discussed, specifically like the desynchronization of the default mode network, and the other mechanisms that you talked about, I wonder if those are generalizable to other types of psychedelics, so like LSD, for example, or if that's mainly just a psilocybin response.
Yeah, great question. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, so everything we've been talking about in this presentation, like the entropic brain state and the desynchronization of the default mode network, that's generalizable across classic psychedelics. So that's classic psychedelics are those that act on the serotonergic 5-HT2A receptors. And the classic psychedelics include psilocybin, LSD, DMT, mescaline. And those are all thought to produce somewhat similar entropic brain states, and they disrupt the default mode network. And evidence so far, the research is strongest for psilocybin and LSD. That being said, the pattern is not identical across all compounds. There's differences both in the neuroscience and, of course, in the subjective experiences. But thank you for clarifying that.
Thank-
Um, Great. So we are rounding up at the half hour. I don't want to keep anyone too long because I know it's Thanksgiving Eve, but I wanted to thank you all so much for coming and for your attention. Um, let's see. Oh, I noticed there's a couple. chats. Okay, great. One announcement before I let you all leave is that, as you know, this is part of the Buena Vida, and we run retreats through Mexico, in Mexico, and in Joshua Tree. And guests who came today are invited to any of the 2026 retreats with a special 20% off until this weekend with the code Old Friends. I'll put that in the chat. So if you're curious at all, I'm going to send this to everyone. That is the code, and you can get an extra 20% off. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm also one of the facilitators with the Buena Vida. I'm also on the research team. Yeah, so thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you all have an amazing Thanksgiving. Take
That's
care.
very, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Of course.